Hi, this is Cliff at Norman's Printery. In this video, we're giving you some tips on how to choose fonts to use, especially in small sizes. What can happen is when we screen print small text, it's possible if the font is too contrasty that part of it won't print. And so a high contrast font, for starters, is this E here. And anytime you have a really thick part of a font and a really thin part of a font of a letter like this, that's what we call a high contrast font. So keep that in mind as we look through some of these tips. So I'm sure you're all familiar with font weights. So this again is the typeface freight, and these are different font weights. And then some fonts also have size specific families. So this again is all the typeface freight, but it's been designed to be used at different sizes. So starting at the top here, this is designed to be used in very small sizes. Text is around 7 point, and then display and big, these are meant to be used in very large sizes like book covers or billboards, things where you can use this at a very large size. Well, let's zoom in and see what's different about these. So we see, let's start at the bottom with freight big. We see high contrast, like we talked about earlier, thick areas and thin areas, and we just see beautiful curves, and it's just a very elegant, very nice font at this size, meant to be used really large. And as we get down, we see less and less contrast. So looking from freight big to freight text, if we zoom in on that, we see there's a lot less contrast. There's still some, but look at the F, for instance. This bar here is not too much different than these. And then as we get to macro, there's almost no difference at all. A little bit in the serifs here, but it's almost a completely uniform weight across all the letters and all the different parts of the letter. And then in micro, we actually see something different where it's a very uniform weight as well, but certain areas are emphasized so they don't totally drop when they're printed at very small sizes. So this is what this font developer, the choices they made to keep the spirit of the font from a very big font to a very small font, but engineer it in a way that it's going to print well and be readable at these different sizes. So that's something the font developer had in mind when they developed these, and it's something that as designers we should be aware of when we're choosing fonts. So let's see how these different font weights print. On the left side of the screen, you're going to see freight big at 10 point. And what you're seeing here and down here, these are actual printed samples. This is white ink printed on a amber glass jar. And on the right side, you see freight text at 10 point as well. And again, the printed samples showing an enlarged view under the microscope. So we see here with this E, with this high contrast E for this freight big, which is meant to be printed at large sizes, we can see in the F, and especially in the E here, where that's fallen apart. And we see in the freight text version that those areas, because they're not as high contrast, have printed very well. So what's happening in screen printing, especially, this is true of other print processes, but especially in screen printing, is this thin area just is not thick enough to be transferred from the film onto the screen. And so the screen will get made when this part of the screen will be closed up and not print, or it'll be such a small hole that the ink will dry very quickly into that and will not print well. However, when we look over to the text weight version, because it's lower contrast, this is going to print much cleaner and the text will be much more legible. So what does that mean for your design process? Well, of course, we would recommend against choosing the higher contrast fonts, especially at smaller sizes. And if you have the option to use a text weight version of the font, that would be really important to use as well. What happens, I think, a lot of the times is as designers we're working zoomed in, we're really close just because it helps. It makes things easier to see, to align, it's easier on the eyes, and we get used to seeing these fonts at larger sizes and are designed at a larger size. And so one of the tips is to zoom out and view your product, view your screen at 100%. And think about what would this look like when it's actually printed, when I'm holding it in my hand. Is this text getting really small? Anytime you're down in the 4, 5, 6 point text, know that that's extremely small. And although it can be doable, you need to consider the font weight and contrast when you're working at those point sizes. So again, this is the display on the left and the text weight on the right. And even that small change of going to a less contrasty font, bumping up our line point in this little logo here, this would print much better than this would. And you can see there's not a huge difference. It's just a bit less contrast. And on the screen, you know, I think what happens is we fall in love with these really beautiful, elegant fonts, but we're forgetting that at a small size, it's not going to print well. And we might see this on screen and think, oh, I don't like that as much. But that's what's going to print very well, and it'll still have that, again, the spirit of the typeface as it was intended to be. It'll just be legible, and you won't be dropping parts of the letters. All right, so in closing here, some tips we recommend. Use size-appropriate fonts. Avoid those high-contrast, thick and thin fonts in small sizes. So it could be any font, but if it has high contrast, really thick areas to really thin areas, don't use that in probably 4 to 7 point, maybe even higher. In that example we showed earlier, that was a display size font at 10 point. So even 10 point with the wrong font might not print well with screen printing. And keep the final product in mind. Zoom out as you're working. Remember what the product's going to look like in the physical world, not just zoomed in on a computer monitor. And here's a hot take warning, but we think that legibility supersedes strict consistency. And what we mean by that is if you're choosing a font just because that's what your logo is, or that's what a font on another product you've made is, don't feel that you have to use that exact font in that weight just to keep your brand consistency. Choose fonts that still fit your branding. Of course, your brand and your look being consistent is very important, but choose fonts and choose design elements in your product that are going to print well for the process you're choosing. It won't help if you've used the same font, but at certain sizes they break up, they're not readable, or they don't look very good. So those are some tips that we recommend. If you have any questions about the appropriateness of a font at a certain size for a certain print process, feel free to ask. We're happy to help.